Welcome to LexTalks Legal Topics Simplified, where we break down Indian law for students and enthusiasts.
And today we're going deep on the doctrine of part performance.
Okay, Doctrine of Part Performance
Under the Transfer of Property Act of 1882,
of 1882.
it sounds a little intimidating,
It does sound a little complicated.
but it's actually a lot more straightforward than it seems.
All right, so break it down for us.
So you know how property deals usually involve a lot of paperwork?
Oh, yeah, tons.
This doctrine basically acts as a safety net when things aren't totally finalized.
I see.
So imagine you're buying a piece of land, you've already paid part of the price, maybe even started building a fence.
Okay.
But for whatever reason, the official sale deed hasn't been registered yet.
So you're kind of acting like the owner.
Right, you're acting like the owner, but technically on paper you're not.
Right.
Now, what if the seller suddenly gets cold feet and tries to back out of the deal?
Uh-oh.
That's where the doctrine of part performance comes in to protect you.
Okay, so it prevents someone from just changing their mind?
Exactly. It stops people from using technicalities to weasel out of agreements when you've already held up your end of the bargain.
So there must be some rules around when this doctrine can be applied.
Of course there are rules, and they're laid out in Section 53A of the Transfer of Property Act of 1882.
Section 53A, the rule book.
Yeah, you can think of it as the Doctrines rulebook.
Okay, so what's rule number 1?
First, there has to be a written contract for the transfer of the property.
Okay.
No verbal agreements or secret handshakes. It's got to be documented.
That makes sense. Keeps things clear.
Exactly. And that contract has to be for something of value, what we call consideration in legal terms.
Consideration.
So gifting a property wouldn't fall under this doctrine.
Interesting.
There needs to be a proper transaction with something being exchanged.
Got it. What else?
The contract also needs to be signed by the person selling or giving the property the transfer.
To transfer.
Right. Their signature shows their intent to transfer the property.
It makes it official.
Exactly. And all the terms of the transfer, what's being transferred, for how much, under what conditions, all of that has to be crystal clear.
So no room for ambiguity.
Right. You don't want any loopholes that could let someone back out of the deal later.
Makes sense.
And this is where it gets really interesting. The buyer or the transferee,
Okay.
they need to have either taken possession of the property or continued possessing it as part of fulfilling the contract.
Okay, but when we talk about possession, it's not just about physically being on the property.
You're absolutely right. Possession under this doctrine means acting like you own the place.
Okay.
It's about demonstrating a clear intention to follow through with the agreement, even if all the paperwork isn't finalized yet.
Showing that you're serious.
Exactly.
So give me some examples of what acting like the owner might look like.
Sure. Let's say you've agreed to buy a farm.
Okay, a farm.
You might start cultivating the land, making repairs to the farmhouse, or even paying property taxes. These are all acts that go beyond just living there. They show a commitment to the agreement.
Yeah, you do.
And there's one more piece to this possession puzzle. The transferee also needs to have done something else to further the contract beyond just taking possession.
Like what?
The most common example is making payments towards the purchase price.
Makes sense.
It could also involve things like getting necessary permits or approvals related to the property.
Okay.
The key is that these actions have to be directly related to fulfilling the terms of the contract.
So you can't just be hanging out on the property. You have to be actively trying to complete the deal.
Exactly. All these elements together paint a picture of genuine commitment to the deal. That's what the doctrine of part performance looks for, actions that speak louder than words.
That's a great explanation. I think I'm starting to get it. Now, are there any famous cases that show how this doctrine has played out in Indian courts?
Absolutely. There are tons of landmark cases that have shaped the way we understand part performance. One of the most significant is Mahadeo Natuji Patil versus Surjabai Kushal Chandlakad and Ors.
Wow, what a mouthful. What makes that case so important?
This case is a classic example of how the doctrine prevents injustice. It highlights that the whole point of equity in property law is to ensure fairness, not to create gridlock.
Okay.
If someone is trying to back out of a deal they've partially fulfilled just because of a technicality, the courts can step in and say, nope, that's not how we do things.
So it protects people from being taken advantage of.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Now, another case that sheds light on this doctrine is Padmalabha Panda versus Apple and Arasama and Ors. This one went all the way to the Privy Council, which was the highest court of appeal for India at the time.
Wow, high stakes. So what happened in that case?
In this case, the Privy Council raised some concerns about directly applying the English version of the doctrine of part performance to the Indian context.
Interesting. Why is that? What's the difference?
Well, the English version is a bit more lenient. It sometimes allows for property interests to be created even without a valid registered document.
Oh,
The Privy Council felt that this could contradict the intent of the Transfer of Property Act, which places a strong emphasis on registration.
so it's about finding a balance between preventing fraud and upholding the importance of proper documentation.
Exactly. The Padmalabha Panda case shows how Indian courts have adapted the doctrine to fit our specific legal framework, giving weight to both fairness and the formality of registration.
That's really interesting. It's like the doctrine is evolving to find that sweet spot between flexibility and legal certainty.
You got it.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it so interesting to study. It's not just a set of rigid rules, it's a dynamic concept that's constantly being interpreted and applied to real-life situations.
This has been super helpful, but I think I need a little break to process all this information. We'll be back in the next segment to delve even deeper into the doctrine of part performance.
Sounds good.
Welcome back to LexTalks.
All right.
We're ready to dive back into the doctrine of part performance.
Yeah, let's get back into it.
So you were talking about possession and how it's more than just being physically present on a property.
Exactly.
Can you talk more about that intention to possess as an owner idea?
Sure. So it's all about looking at the actions of the person claiming part performance.
Okay.
Let's say someone is living on a property, but they aren't doing anything that really suggests they see themselves as the owner.
Like what kind of things?
They're not making repairs, they're not paying taxes, they're basically just existing there.
So they're more like a tenant than an owner.
Exactly. In that scenario, they wouldn't have that crucial intention to possess as an owner that's required for the doctrine of part performance.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about those trickier situations where it's not so obvious?
Yeah, those are the interesting ones.
Are there any cases that help clarify how to determine that intention?
Absolutely. Indian courts have dealt with some pretty nuanced scenarios.
Okay.
One case that comes to mind is Ramchandra Reddy and others versus Lakshmana and another.
What happened there?
Well, in that case, the court had to figure out whether certain actions like cultivating the land and paying land revenue were enough to establish possession under part performance.
So it wasn't just about being there, it was about how they were using the land.
Exactly. And in this case, the court said that those actions taken together did indicate an intention to possess the property as an owner.
It showed a deeper level of commitment.
Right. It went beyond just occupying the property.
That's really helpful. And are there any other cases that illustrate this concept?
Oh, there are tons. Another one worth mentioning is K.S. Vidyananda versus T.S. Rajgopal.
Okay, K.S. Vidyananda versus T.S. Rajgopal.
In this case, the buyer actually constructed a building on the land.
Wow.
And this was seen as clear evidence of the intention to possess as an owner.
Yeah, that's a pretty big step.
Definitely. It demonstrates a level of financial and emotional investment that's usually associated with ownership.
So the courts take those kinds of actions seriously.
They do. They see it as strong evidence of intention.
This is all making a lot more sense now. But are there any criticisms or debates surrounding this doctrine?
Of course. Like with anything in law, there are always different perspectives.
What are some of the main criticisms?
One of the main criticisms is that the doctrine of part performance can sometimes undermine the importance of registration
Okay.
and formal documentation in property transactions.
Because it allows agreements that haven't been properly registered to still be enforceable.
Exactly. Critics argue that this could create some uncertainty in property dealings and make it harder to verify ownership.
So it's kind of a double-edged sword.
Yeah, it protects against fraud, but it also has the potential to weaken the system of registration.
It's all about balance, I guess.
It is. There's also the argument that the doctrine can be a bit subjective and open to interpretation.
Subjective.
Yeah, because deciding what constitutes possession and intention can be tricky.
Right, especially in those gray areas.
Exactly. And that lack of clarity can be frustrating for everyone involved.
So it sounds like this is an area of law that's still being figured out.
It definitely is. The courts are always refining their understanding of the doctrine and how to apply it. It's a dynamic area of law.
For sure. Now let's talk about practical implications.
Okay.
How does this doctrine affect legal strategy for both buyers and sellers? What advice would you give someone who's about to enter into a property agreement?
The most important advice I can give is to get everything in writing
Okay.
and get it registered.
So even if it's with family or friends?
Exactly. Don't skip the formalities no matter how much you trust the other party.
Right.
Proper documentation protects everyone and prevents headaches down the road.
That's good advice. And what if someone's already taken possession under a partially fulfilled agreement? What should they do?
Document everything. Keep records of payments, improvements, made any actions that show your commitment to the deal.
So create a paper trail that backs up their claim.
Exactly. If a dispute arises, that documentation can be really valuable.
It's like proof of their intentions.
Right. It makes it much easier to prove your case.
So if it's not documented, it didn't happen.
I know.
But what if someone finds themselves in a situation where they're already relying on this doctrine of part performance?
In that case, the first step is to get legal advice.
Okay.
Talk to an experienced property lawyer.
To get some expert guidance.
Exactly. They can look at the specifics of your situation and help you figure out the best way to move forward.
Don't try to handle it alone.
No, property law can be really complex. It's always best to have an expert on your side.
That's solid advice.
Yeah.
This deep dive into the doctrine of part performance has been incredibly informative.
Glad to hear it.
We've covered so much ground. But before we move on to the next part, I'd love to get your final thoughts on the significance of this doctrine in the broader context of Indian law.
What I find fascinating about the doctrine of part performance is that it highlights this tension that exists in a lot of legal systems.
What tension?
The tension between upholding formal rules and ensuring fairness in practice.
Right.
It shows that the law recognizes that sometimes strictly following procedure can lead to unjust outcomes.
So it's a way to balance those two things.
Exactly. The doctrine of part performance acts as a sort of safety valve.
I like that, a safety valve.
It acknowledges that actions can matter more than words, and that fairness should prevail even if every technicality isn't met.
It's about achieving justice.
It is. And in the world of property where emotions and financial stakes can run high, that balance is really important.
Absolutely. The doctrine of part performance reminds us that the law isn't just about blindly following rules.
Right.
It's about making sure that things are fair.
And that's a principle that remains important as the world of law continues to evolve.
So it really emphasizes that actions matter just as much as the paperwork.
Right. It's not enough to just have a contract. You have to actually follow through on your commitments.
And you mentioned earlier that this idea of actions mattering in legal agreements isn't just limited to property law, right?
Yeah, you're right. It goes beyond just property. The doctrine of part performance shows us a bigger principle in Indian law.
What's that?
It highlights the fact that sometimes actions can be even stronger than a written contract.
So even if you have a super detailed contract, if your actions don't match up,
Exactly.
you might not have a leg to stand on legally.
Exactly. It's about showing good faith and actually doing what you said you would do.
I see. So it's like a reminder that the law isn't just about words on a page.
Right? It's about real-world actions and consequences.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And this idea of actions mattering applies to all sorts of agreements, not just those related to property.
Absolutely. It's a good principle to keep in mind for any kind of legal agreement.
So if I start acting like I've agreed to something,
Right.
even if the paperwork isn't fully finalized, the law might hold me to that.
That's right.
That's really interesting. And it seems like it could lead to some tricky situations,
It can.
especially when it comes to figuring out what actions are enough to show that commitment.
Exactly. Like
Yeah.
we were talking about with possession, just stepping foot on the property isn't enough.
Right.
You have to actually act like the owner.
And I imagine the courts have had to deal with a lot of cases where it's not so clear-cut.
Oh, tons of them. And that's what makes this area of law so complex.
Because it can be kind of subjective.
Right. Determining possession and intent can be tricky.
And I guess that also raises a concern about the potential for misuse.
It does.
This doctrine is designed to protect people from fraud,
Right.
but couldn't it also be used by someone who's trying to take advantage of a situation?
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to have a solid understanding of the doctrine and how it's been applied in different cases.
So people know their rights and limitations.
Exactly.
And if someone is relying on the doctrine of part performance,
Yeah.
it seems like documentation would be super important.
It is. Keep records of everything. Receipts, photos, anything that can prove your actions.
It's like building your case before you even know you'll need one.
Exactly. It makes it much easier for the court to see your side of the story.
And I think that ties back to that theme of fairness we've been talking about.
Right.
The law is trying to protect people and make sure agreements are upheld. But it also has to balance that with preventing people from being tricked or taken advantage of.
Absolutely. It's a delicate balance.
Well, this has been a fascinating exploration of the doctrine of part performance.
It has.
We've covered so much ground.
We have.
And I think the key takeaway here is get everything in writing
Yes.
and get it registered.
Always.
But if you find yourself in a situation where you have to rely on this doctrine,
Yeah.
talk to a lawyer and make sure you have all the evidence you need.
Solid advice.
Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. It's been a pleasure.
It's been my pleasure, too. Always happy to talk about the law.
And to all of you listening, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Doctrine of Part Performance. We hope you found it informative and maybe even a little bit entertaining.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
Until next time, keep exploring the fascinating world of Indian law. Thank you for listening to LexTalks. Hit subscribe and keep the legal conversations going.